rest of his soldiers. He conquered that country and the whole of Germany too, after a number of desperate battles, gaining the victory in every fight. He set up the capital of his empire at Treves. Then he vented his fury upon the two emperors, Gratianus and Valentinianus, killing the one and driving the second out of Rome. Meanwhile, the Gauls and the Aquitanians were causing great trouble to Conanus and his Amorican Britons. They harassed the newcomers by attacking them time and time again. Conanus resisted these attacks, returning bloodshed for bloodshed and defending with great manliness the country committed to his charge. Once he had gained the victory, he decided to find wives for his troops, so that heirs might be born from them who should hold the land forever. To prevent any mixture of blood with the Gauls, he ordered women to come from the island of Britain and to be married to his men. With this end in view, he sent messages to Britain, to Deonatus, Duke of Cornwall, who had succeeded his brother Caradocus in the kingship of Britain, telling him to take personal charge of the business. Deonatus was a king of great nobility and power. It was to him that Maximianus had entrusted the rule of the island, while he himself was occupied with the affairs described above. He had a daughter of extraordinary beauty, whom Conanus had always wanted for his own. When he saw the messenger come from Conanus, Deonatus agreed to meet his wishes. He therefore assembled from the various provinces 11,000 daughters of noblemen, with 60,000 others born to the lower orders, and commanded them all to come together in the city of London. In addition, he ordered ships to be brought there from the different coasts, in which they could cross the sea to the husbands whom I have mentioned. This pleased many in the great crowd, but it displeased an even greater number, who loved their parents and their homeland with deeper affection. Moreover, there were some present who preferred chastity to marriage, and would rather have forfeited their lives. No matter what people that have become rich in this way. Indeed, they had their personal wishes in the matter, if only they had been able to achieve what they really wanted. However, the fleet was made ready. The women went on board the ships, and they put out to sea down the river Thames. On the last part of the journey, just as they were turning their sails towards the men of Armorica, contrary winds sprang up against the fleet, and this scattered the whole company in a very short time. The ships ran the hazard of the seas, and for the most part they foundered. Those which escaped this terrible danger were driven ashore on islands inhabited by barbarians. The women were either slaughtered by the uncivilized islanders, or were sold into slavery. They had fallen in with the execrable army of Wanius and Melga, who on this is the story of Saint Ursula, Dionysus' daughter of extraordinary beauty, whom Conanus had always wanted for his own. As soon as Vanius and Melga, the leaders of the abominable Picts and Huns, who favoured the cause of Gracianus and Valentinius, learned that the island of Britain was denuded of all its armed what is greater than these, their own liberty and their very lives, this by fighting manfully with all their strength, in order to give themselves an opportunity of delivering this warning in full public. The Romans ordered all men of military age in the island to assemble in London, for they themselves were making ready to return to Rome. When everyone had come together, Githellenius, the Archbishop of London, was ordered to speak. He made the following speech to them. When, at the command of the princes who stand around me, I am forced to address you, I feel more like bursting into tears than embarking upon a lofty discourse. I am greatly saddened by the state of deprivation and abjectness which has overtaken you since Maximianus stripped this kingdom of all its army and all its young men. You are simply the last remains left, common people, ignorant of the ways of war, men who are busied in other matters, some in cultivating their fields, for example, others in the various makeshifts of business life. When hostile men of other nations came to attack days they occupied Britain in all tranquillity, and what is more, they added far distant realms to their own power. Thus it is when a kingdom is handed over to the safekeeping of its peasantry. What more can I say? Cities were abandoned, and the high wall too, for the inhabitants, banishments, dispersions, which were even more desperate than usual, pursuits by the enemy, and more bloody slaughters followed fast upon each other. Just as sheep are torn apart by the wolves, so were the wretched plebs maltreated by their enemies. Once more the miserable remnants sent letters to Agesius, the general commanding the Roman forces, to convey the following appeal: To Agesius, 3 times consul, come the groans of the Britons. There followed a short introduction, and then they continued their complaints as follows. The sea drives us into the hands of the barbarians, and the barbarians drive us into the sea. Between the two of them, we have 2 deaths to choose from. We can either be drowned, or have our throats cut. For all this, the messengers returned sadly home to explain to their fellow citizens the lack of success, for they had received no promise of help. So that ends the chapter, The Coming of the Romans. Now we are on part 4. The House of Constantine. The Britons took counsel, and Geoffrey, the Archbishop of London, then crossed the sea to Little Britain, called at that time Armorica or Latavia, to seek help from their blood brothers. In those days, Aldronius ruled the country, the 4th king after Conanus, to which last Maximianus had entrusted the realm, as was explained earlier on. When he set eyes upon so revered a man, Aldronius received him honourably and asked the cause of his coming. The nobility of your bearing, replied Geoffrey, is clear to see. The grief which we, your fellow Britons, have suffered since Maximianus despoiled our island of its soldiers, ordering them to colonize this kingdom of yours, over which you rule and will continue to rule in lasting peace, can well move you to tears. All the peoples who live near our island have risen against us, for we are the poverty-stricken remnants of your own nation. They have completely ransacked our island, which was once a treasure home of every kind of wealth. All the peoples who live there are desperately short of nourishing food, except for the relief which they can find by their skill in hunting. There has been no one to stop this, for not a single strong man, not one military leader, was left to us, our own people. The Romans are no longer interested in us, for they have refused to help us in any way at all. Deprived as we are of all other help, we have come to you for sympathy. We beg you to give us your help and to protect our kingdom, which is yours by right, from invasion by the barbarians. If you are unwilling to help, what other man is there in existence who could be honoured with the crown of Constantine and Maximianus as your possess a smaller competency elsewhere and remain free, rather than own Britain's riches under the yoke of slavery. This kingdom, on the other hand, which is now subject to my own rule, I hold with honour, and without the obligé of doing homage to one more mighty than myself. It is for that reason that I have preferred it to all other nations, for I govern it in liberty. Nevertheless, since my grandfathers and great-grandfathers ruled over your island, I hereby agree to place my brother Constantine under your command, with 2,000 soldiers, so that if God permit that he should free the country from this barbarian invasion, he may place its crown upon his head. This brother of mine, who bears the name which I have mentioned, is skilled in military affairs, and well endowed with other virtues. I will certainly transfer his services to you, with the number of men which I have promised, if you for your part are willing to accept him. I have quite made up my mind, however, that I must refuse you any greater force of soldiers, for the possibility of an attack by the Gauls threatens me daily. As soon as Aldronius stopped speaking, the archbishop expressed his thanks, and Constantine was summoned. Gethylenius was delighted to see him. Christ is victorious, he cried. Christ is king. Christ rules over us. If only Christ is on our side, then you are the king of a deserted Britain. You are our defence, our hope, our joy. What more is there to say? The ships were made ready. On the shore, the soldiers were chosen from the various regions of the kingdom and handed over to Gethylenius. As soon as everything was ready, they put out to sea. They landed in the port of Totnes. Without losing a moment, they assembled all the young men who still remained in the island and attacked the enemy. By the skill of this heaven-sent leader, they were victorious. The Britons, who until this moment had been scattered far and wide, now flocked together from all sides. A council was held at Silchester, and they raised Constantine to the kingship, setting the crown of the realm upon his head. Then they gave him a wife, born of a noble family, whom Archbishop Gethylenius had himself brought up. When their marriage had been consummated, the king had 3 sons by her. Their names were Constans, Aurelius, Ambrosius, and Utherpendragon. The king handed Constans, his firstborn, over to the church of Amphibalus in Winchester, so that he might enter a monastic order. The other 2, Aurelius and Utherpendragon, he gave to Gethylenius, that he might bring them up. Finally, when 10 years had passed, there came a certain Pict, who had been in the service of Constantine, pretending that it was necessary for him to have a private conversation with the king in a thicket, with everyone else sent away. The Pict stabbed Constantine to death with his dagger. As soon as Constantine was dead, a disagreement arose among the leaders as to who should be raised to the throne. Some were in favour of Aurelius Ambrosius, others of Utherpendragon, and still others of various close relatives of the royal family. Finally, while they were still arguing for this claimant and that, there came on the scene Vortigern, leader of the Gawesi, who was himself busy making every possible effort to lay hands on the crown. He paid a visit to the monk was his own lack of character which made him act in this way, plus the fact that what he had learned in the cloister had nothing to do with how to rule a kingdom. Vortigern was so encouraged by this that he began to plan in his heart how he could himself be made king. This was what he had coveted above all things for a long time, and now he saw that the moment was coming when his desire could easily be achieved. The whole kingdom had been placed under his own control, and Constans, who was called king, stood there as the mere shadow of a leader. To his own subjects he appeared as a man totally lacking in severity and judicial authority, and he inspired no fear in the neighbouring peoples. His two brothers, Uther Pendragon and Aurelius Ambrosius, still lay in their cradles, and could hardly be raised to the kingship. A further accident had happened in that the older leaders of the kingdom had died off, and so Vortigern seemed the only man available who was wise and astute, with advice to offer that was worth anything at all. Almost all the others were boys or young men who had come into their honours by some chance or other, when their fathers and uncles had been killed off in the recent fighting. Vortigern fully understood all this. He was busy meditating how he could most safely and cunningly depose the monk Constans and force his own way into the latter's position. He decided to defer this until he had first of all subjected the various tribes to his own rule, and given them a chance to become used to him. He began to transfer the royal treasure away from Constans into his own keeping, and the cities too, with their garrisons, saying that a rumour was going round that the men of the neighbouring islands were planning an attack. Once he had achieved this, he stationed his own supporters there to hold these cities in allegiance to him. Still plotting the treason which he had in his heart, he next went to Constans and told him that it was necessary for the establishment of his own household to be increased, so that he could face in greater safety the enemies who were about to attack him. "Have I not put everything under your command?" answered Constans. "Do whatever you want to, provided only that the men retain their ultimate fidelity to me." "It has been reported to me," continued Vortigern, "that the Picts intend to lead the Danes and the Norwegians against us, in an attempt to do us the greatest possible harm. I therefore advise, and this I consider to be the safest course, that you should keep certain of the Picts in your own court, to act as liaison officers between you and the rest of their nation. If it is true that the Picts have already begun to prepare war, then these men will spy out for you the secret weapons and the battle plans of their own nationals, which you can then avoid all the more easily. In this you can see the hidden treachery of a secret enemy." Vortigern was advising this, not in order to ensure the safety of Constans, but because he knew that the Picts were gave it out that the little he had would not possibly suffice for him to pay the wages of even 50 soldiers. Then he went home, apparently greatly downcast, and left them drinking in the hall. When they saw this, the Picts were more depressed than one can imagine, for they thought that what he had said was true. They grumbled among themselves. "Why do we let this man go on living?" they asked. "Why don't we kill him so that Vortigern can take over the royal throne? Who else in the kingdom could possibly succeed Constans? Vortigern is the man who ought to rule. He ought to be honoured and be granted every dignity, for there is no limit to the rewards which he gives us." Without more ado, they burst into the king's bedroom, and there they attacked Constans and killed him. They carried his head to Vortigern. When he saw it, he burst into tears, as if the sight had saddened him, although he had really never been so happy in his life before. He called the citizens of London together. For it was in that city that this had happened. He ordered the traitors to be bound, and then to have their heads cut off while they were still tied up. This for having dared to commit so dastardly a crime. There were some who thought that this treasonable act had really been planned by Vortigern, in that the Picts would never have undertaken such a deed without his consent. Others, however, had no hesitation in acquitting him of such a crime. The matter was never cleared up. However, those in charge of the upbringing of the two brothers, Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther Pendragon, fled with their charges to Little Britain, just in case the two should be murdered by Vortigern. King Boudicius received them there and brought them up with due honour. As soon as Vortigern realised that there was now no one at all in the realm who was his equal, he set the kingly crown upon his own head and assumed precedence over his fellow princes. Some time later, his treason became known. The peoples of the neighbouring islands, whom the Picts had brought over into Albany, revolted against him. The Picts themselves were incensed because their comrades in arms had been executed on account of Constans, and they kept doing their utmost to take revenge on Vortigern. As day followed day, the king was therefore much concerned to see the casualties of his army in battle. What is more, he was haunted by the fear of Aurelius Ambrosius and his brother Uther Pendragon, who, as explained already, had fled to Little Britain because of him. His ears were filled with a constantly repeated description of how they had come to man's estate, and were planning to launch an enormous fleet against the kingdom which really belonged to them. About this time there landed in certain parts of Kent 3 vessels of the type which we call long ships. They were full of armed warriors, and there were 2 brothers named Hengist and Horsa in command of them. At that moment Vortigern was at Jurabernia, which is now called Canterbury, for it was his custom to visit that city very frequently, when messengers reported to him that unknown men, and what is more, men of huge stature, had landed in enormous ships. Vortigern made peaceful overtures to them and ordered them to be led into his presence. As soon as they were brought in, he fixed his eyes on the 2 brothers, for they stood out amongst the others because of their noble bearing and their good looks. Vortigern examined all the others, and then asked which country they had travelled from, and why they had come to the land over which he ruled. Hengist started to reply for the others, for his greater maturity and his good sense has happened recently that in our own country the supply of men has become too great. Our leaders met to cast lots. They chose these young men whom you see in your presence, and ordered them to obey the tradition handed down from ancient time. They elected us 2 brothers as their leaders, simply because we come from the ruling family. Myself, who bear the name Hengist, and this man who is called Horsa. We duly obeyed the decrees, whose authority is sanctioned by their antiquity. We put to sea, and with only Mercury to guide us, we journeyed to your kingdom. When he heard the name Mercury mentioned, the king looked them full in the face and asked them what their religion was. We worship the gods of our own country, replied Hengist, Saturn, Jove, and the others who rule over this world, and more especially Mercury, whom in our language we call Woden. Our ancestors